J'ai le plaisir de...
It is my pleasure to open this third substantive session of today, which is devoted to the issue of online incitement, terrorist narratives, and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. During this session, the three panelists will identify and analyze key aspects of terrorist exploitation of information and communications technologies, including the internet, to disseminate terrorist narratives. I would like warmly to welcome the three experts who are taking part in this debate. Each of them will make a maximum 12-minute presentation. I shall now give the floor to Mr. Bharath Ganesh from the Oxford Internet Institute and VOX-Pol. Mr. Ganesh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of trying to regulate and manage all of the content that tends to be put online, and a lot of it which reaches into this area around extremism. Now, I want to focus on three different actors. So that's going to be looking at nation states, the private sector, particularly social media companies, and civil society. But what I want to do is to try to take this to a slightly different angle. And in doing so, I want to sort of problematize some of the different tensions that we have when trying to look into how best to combat online extremism. So to discuss that in a little bit more depth, I have three kind of main problem areas that I want to develop. The first one is around content moderation and censorship. The second is on the role and the politics of the private sector. The third is on counter-narratives and the engagement of civil society. I think in each of these three areas, there's a significant number of challenges that need to be surmounted before approaches to countering extremist narratives are going to be effective, and before we're going to be able to actually learn how to measure and analyze the efficacy of different kinds of counter-extremist initiatives. So one of the things that I want to do is actually think a little bit about what kind of outcomes are emerging from these three sets of actors that are coming together. One of the really key questions I think hasn't been asked in this agenda is understanding the role of power and who's actually accumulating power in the way that this agenda is playing out. So what I mean by that is I think that social media companies and technology companies have a disproportionate amount of power in this agenda. Nation states, of course, bear the brunt of the responsibility for dealing with extremism, but there is a tension between nation states and the private sector that I think needs to be worked out. And I hope to bring out some of those problems in order to better think about the ways we might approach that. Moving on, then, I'd like to sort of think about what kind of implications this power distribution has for how we do content moderation and censorship, how the private sector reaches out to civil society, and how states are able to engage civil society, and then understand sort of how counter-narratives might work in this area. So I've kind of put together four general questions that I'd like to raise that are sort of areas that are lacking in terms of understanding content moderation and censorship. And when I'm talking about content moderation, what I'm talking about is a private sector company like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Those are the big ones, but there's hundreds of others that are involved in this agenda, deciding to take down some kind of content or deciding to enact some kind of punitive measure on a user, such as suspending their account for a few days or taking their account away, taking down content that they've written for any number of reasons. And the kind of primary reasons that this is happening, especially in the role around extremism, is looking at hate speech as well as incitement to violence. Those are sort of the two big categories. Now, one of the key problems here is we don't actually know how effective disruption is. Now, we've heard from a few different speakers that, for example, when Twitter and other social media companies began actively trying to disrupt Daesh's efforts in terms of in terms of recruitment and disseminating propaganda online, there was a very rapid reduction in their ability to use mainstream platforms like Twitter to go about disseminating information. On the other hand, this has also led groups like Daesh into kind of different areas of the internet that are much harder to monitor, much harder to police, and also, for example, are encrypted. So their migration to Telegram, for example, is one kind of way you might think about the sort of the kind of cost benefit of getting involved in doing takedowns and other types of disruption techniques. So one thing we really need to understand, and I think this is a key area for collaboration between the private sector and the scientific community, is understanding how effective disruption and takedown techniques are. The second point I'd like to raise is around the kind of controversial politics of censorship. So one thing that we've seen is that when IS accounts tend to be taken down, this leads to, so when IS accounts get taken down, this leads to a certain increase in their likelihood to come back. So what happens is when someone gets censored on Twitter for some kind of for hate speech or for incitement to violence or engaging in some kind of terrorist communication, they get their account taken down, they tend to come back, and that actually leads to a sort of an increased level of sense of participation and integration into these networks. So I do a lot of work looking into right-wing extremism in the United Kingdom and the United States. And one of the things that we've seen there is actually an entire mobilization of right-wing extremist activity around the concept of the freedom of speech being taken away from people. So just a few weeks ago in London, there was a march attended by a few thousand people that was called Day for Freedom, and that was entirely sort of centered around this issue of free speech and the sense that in the kind of parlance of the extreme right, the liberal establishment was trying to silence extreme right, legitimate conservative voices. So there's this really kind of controversial politics of censorship that emerges when we're trying to deal with this issue. And in a lot of ways, it actually can lead to a lot of counterproductive social situations that emerge afterwards. Which one is IS accounts coming back online after getting a sense of being a martyr. In another sense, you have sort of movements being built around this issue, around the freedom of speech. So this kind of gets me into the main thing that I want to problematize when we're talking about content moderation and censorship. It's the sort of subjective ways in which extremism is being defined. Now, in the United Kingdom, there's one particular definition of extremism, and this one actually covers violent extremism and nonviolent extremism. This obviously is not the same across all nation states. So there's kind of socially and specifically situated ways in which extremism is understood in each and every society and member state. So trying to grapple with this problem is one of the big challenges I think that we need to sort of set out and try to address. One of the big kind of ways that we might make a contribution towards doing that is trying to understand a continuum from hate speech to extremism. One of the previous speakers on the second panel today spoke a little bit about how hateful ideas are being normalized through internet propaganda. These hateful ideas often do not fall into the definition of what we'd call violent extremism, but there's a continuum in terms of these hateful ideas and then the expression of extremism. And by the time people are expressing violent extremism, they've already been kind of radicalized by a certain set of hateful ideas. So this is one of those tensions that we really need to start to work out. There's legal and protected speech that's still hate speech, that's defined differently in every country, and it has a lead-in into the way that we might think about extremism or what kind of effects that extremism might have. So these are sort of kind of the issues that we have to start grappling with. What we've seen happen recently, however, is that the private sector has kind of emerged more and more as a global actor. And one of the things that I tried to set out at the start is the idea that I think the private sector has a sort of disproportionate amount of power in this area. So the private sector has a huge amount of resource, and they also have a huge amount of responsibility because they're the ones who run content moderation, and also are quite involved in terms of funding counter-narrative work. So there's, I think, three areas that really need to be evaluated when we think about what kind of work the private sector is doing in this kind of emerging set of governmental responses and multi-stakeholder responses to online extremism. So the first is, I think we really need to start thinking about how do we understand the effectiveness of the emerging responses from the private sector, as well as public-private partnerships. There's a lot of times in which, for example, the UK government has contracted out to private sector companies. We've seen this happen in other nation states as well. But one of the key problems here is we don't actually have a good basis for figuring out how to evaluate the efficacy of this kind of work. So in that area, I'd kind of make one recommendation that I think is quite important, is having some kind of independent international body involved in some kind of oversight of these companies, and as well as this agenda. And that kind of leads into the next point. One of the key things is that though the private sector has a huge amount of money and they work quite well with a large range of think tanks, there's not a lot of oversight into understanding which voices the kind of participatory which voices are actually able to participate in this agenda. So one way of kind of thinking about that is in the United Kingdom, a lot of studies of the PREVENT strategy, which is a preventing violent extremist set of policy measures, has found that there's been a very selective engagement with particular groups of the Muslim community in Britain. One of the key issues is whether or not those kinds of exclusions are being replicated when it comes to the private sector getting involved. So one of the key things I think is independent review can really help to ensure that there's a diversity of voices involved in shaping how the private sector engages with CVE. And secondly, I think the scientific community needs to play a much more prominent role in this agenda. This is something that's not happened as much, and there's again been somewhat of a selective way in which the scientific community has been brought into this area. So finally, there's another set of kind of issues about how do we measure and understand counter-narratives. There's, I think, a lot. I was kind of coming here, I was reviewing the data that's been published recently around this area, and there's a lot of different conflicting debates. There's a lot of different conflicting methodologies for counter-narratives. So one thing is kind of measuring the effectiveness of counter-narratives. And one of the sort of general problems that I've noticed in this area is that there's kind of some people who do very large studies of counter-narratives, who use kind of big data methods and computational methods to understand this. There's another side where it's much kind of focused on specific impacts on specific people and small groups. So there's sort of two very different data sets that we have to contend with and grapple with in order to try to understand how effective counter-narrative campaigns really are, and sort of trying to find a way around some of these problems, such as kind of use of big data versus very small, not necessarily representative studies to understand the effectiveness of counter-narratives, should make us kind of, I think, be a little bit more cautious in the amount of confidence that we place in counter-narrative campaigns. So the other thing is, the evidence and the discussion, especially in the previous two panels, has stressed the importance of the role of civil society in all of this. And again, I would stress that actually the inclusion of civil society in the design of counter-narratives is really important. One, because of course, civil society are often the people who are tasked with actually delivering counter-narrative services. On top of that, another thing is that civil society groups are quite well informed about kind of the different issues that people in their community face. So for example, work on anti-Muslim hate crime in the United Kingdom has a very good set of data and a good sense of how to address counter-jihad extremism and right-wing extremism. But these groups aren't always being consulted. And what happens is that some of the kind of technological solutions that are being used to counter extremism or to detect hate speech or to detect extremism, which center around supervised machine learning, which requires kind of putting in a data set of stuff that we've already recognized this is extremist, and then a machine goes and learns that and then kind of is able to kind of infer in the future what kind of material is similar. Now, there's a lot of bias that can go into this kind of process depending on what kind of words, what kind of statements, and what kind of definitions you have about extremism. And that can really bias the outcomes that technology is going to have in terms of trying to detect and understand extremism. So one of the things that we need to do, I think, is we need to start thinking kind of a little more cautiously around the area of counter-narratives to put it into context with these other different forms of governance, such as content moderation and some of the actions taken by the private sector, and understand that there's sort of a difference between positive approaches and negative approaches. And that's not positive in terms of what's good or negative in terms of what's bad. Positive means kinds of approaches that add something new. So counter-narratives fit in with that, right? So counter-narratives try to produce an alternative kind of way of thinking about the world, whereas negative approaches, which are much more kind of close to content moderation, are about taking things out. So we really need to sort of think about the tensions between these two approaches. And then sort of finally, my last comment on counter-narratives is that there's a lot of discussion around formal approaches to developing counter-narratives. So formal are different actions or different interventions taken by states, by civil society, and by the private sector to do counter-narrative work. But there's also a lot of activists on these social media platforms that are already trying to engage in counter-narrative work. So there's a whole range of counter-narrative activity that doesn't fit into what we might recognize as such. So I'm talking about kind of activists who might be out trolling counter-jihadists on the internet or trolling the far right on the internet, just as we see groups within Muslim communities across the world challenging the types of narratives that you see coming out from groups like Daesh. So what I'm trying to say there is that there's already a set of organic movements that we need to consider when we're looking at how counter-narratives work. So I kind of want to just bring it back to some sort of key tensions. So the first one is sort of around content, right? We have hate speech, extremism, extremist speech. We have nonviolent extremism. We have violent online extremism. We have incitements to violence. And I would like to get us to think about this as a broad continuum. But we shouldn't only just focus on content. I think one of the key things we need to do is also think about how do we disrupt networks in the way that they operate, right? So it's not just about someone's posting hateful or extreme content, but it's also about having the knowledge and the analysis that tells us what are the groups of users that are trying to do this, and then going out and trying to model and understand the ways that we might be able to attack the networks that they're building in order to disseminate propaganda. Another point that I'd like to bring out is sort of the power of the private sector, I think, is quite disproportionate in this area. And until now, especially with kind of what we've seen in Germany, as well as sort of the kind of scandal around Cambridge Analytica, we've started to see national sovereignty being used in terms of more leverage on the private sector. But I think it's quite important that nation states continue to move forward, trying to ensure that they're representing the interests of their citizens and civil society groups within their country to put pressure on the private sector to take the kind of action that they think is important. And finally, one of the key sort of issues in terms of being able to deliver useful technological solutions requires us to reach out to a wide range of people in global civil society. And this is one area where I think nation states need to step in, and I think a lot of nation states could be doing a better job. And one way to go about doing that is really sort of trying to think through the different competing interests within community groups and faith communities within nation states, and finding a way to integrate a really wide range of voices. So with that, I'd like to end my remarks, and thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Ganesh for his presentation on the problems and challenges when it comes to online content, and in particular the responsibility of the private sector in this domain, and the need to look at the inclusivity of different parts of society. I would now